Japan has a long history, depending on who you ask. On the Wikipedia page, Timeline of Japanese History, the earliest recorded date is 14,000 BCE, more than 16,000 years ago as of this recording in 2023. The first North American settlement, which would become the United States at Jamestown, was settled in 1607 or 415 years ago. On a number line where each number is a year and starting at year 1 CE, this is what the United States would look like. Now, here's what 14,000 BCE would look like. When we do the math, we see that Japan's supposed start of history at 14,000 BCE is almost 40 times longer than that of the United States. That is pretty impressive. However, it is a bit unfair to consider this the true start of Japanese history because this date focuses more on prehistoric developments. That's not to say that this isn't very interesting, however. This video is focused on the Jomon period of Japanese history, the earliest period of Japanese history and also known as the Neolithic period of Japanese history. The Jomon period has a largely disputed starting date, with some scholars saying that it starts as early as 15,000 BCE and some others at around 7,000 BCE. However, it is commonly agreed on that the Jomon period came to an end around 300 BCE as a result of a large influx of Sinic migrants from the Korean peninsula. These migrants are not the main topic of this video, so I won't talk about them until the very end. The start date of 14,000 BCE seems to suggest that Japanese history started sometime around then and not earlier. Yet, despite this, evidence of stone tools suggests that there were people on the Japanese archipelago as far back as 35,000 BCE. If this is the case, then why is the date of 14,000 BCE so special? The answer to that would be the Jomon. The Jomon, much like previous inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago, were a diverse society of hunter-gatherers who entered Japan primarily through Sakhalin when there was a land bridge connecting the two islands to the main continent as a result of the lowered sea levels due to the ongoing ice age. But what was it about the Jomon that made them so special? Let's take a look. The main reason the Jomon stood out so much compared to the previous hunter-gatherer societies on the island was because of their advanced use of pottery. In fact, this is where the word Jomon comes from. Jomon means cord-marked, which comes from the cord-like patterns that occurred in pots found during the Jomon period. Fun fact, these pots found in Japan are some of, if not the oldest in the world, and it is known that the Jomon mastered pottery much earlier than other societies did. The pots of the Jomon were so significant that the Jomon period is further subdivided based primarily on the complexity of the pottery, resulting in the incipient, initial, early, middle, late, and final periods. While it may seem silly for us in the modern age to think that something as simple as pots could be so significant, at a time more than twice as old as Sumer, pots would have a profound impact on the way that people lived in Japan. In Jomon society, pottery played a massive role in things which we take for granted now, such as the ability to cook food and the ability to store items. To put that in a modern perspective, imagine trying to cook your food without any pots or pans, or trying to reach for any oils which you cannot get because you are unable to store them. Then, imagine after you somehow cook this meal, you try to eat it on the floor or a big rock instead of on a plate at a table. Not very fun, huh? Overall, the advancement of pottery greatly stabilized the diets of the Jomon, which in turn led to a slow but noticeable increase in the population in the Japanese archipelago, which would continue all the way to the late Jomon period. While the Jomon are well known for their pottery, their innovation didn't simply stop at clay. Many technologies associated with hunter-gatherer societies were absent in Japan until the Jomon arrived and started developing. One of these technologies aided in what remains one of Japan's biggest industries to this day, fishing. The Jomon people made primitive boats by hollowing out large trees, allowing them to travel short distances into deep waters further than they typically could. And the discovery of primitive fish hooks and primitive harpoons suggests that fishing now became an alternative source of getting food for the Jomon. Harpoons have pointy heads. You know what else has pointy heads? Arrows. Bows and arrows specifically, which is another advancement the Jomon were responsible for introducing. Primitive arrowheads weren't limited to just harpoons, but also appeared on what are suspected to be arrows and spears, so we know that their capacity for hunting increased greatly just as theirs did for gathering. Of the thousands of pots excavated throughout Japan that emanated from the Jomon period, a significant portion of them contained fossilized remains of nuts, fruits, and other domesticated plants. It's actually quite disputed about whether or not what the Jomon did was considered farming or not. The Jomon are known to have maintained and even grown plants. In fact, some prehistoric sites have evidence that they grew chestnut trees in their backyards. Most of the diet that the Jomon had came from hunting. Whatever your perspective may be, however, it is agreed that what the Jomon practiced was not agriculture of the same level that would be seen in other societies. In short, many advancements in weaponry and tools allowed for the advancement of the hunter part of hunter-gatherers, and that pottery would have allowed for greater development of the gatherer part. For those who may be less familiar with the term, the word Neolithic may conjure images relating to cavemen, an extremely primal people who speak only in grunts and live in caves, and whose greatest achievement is putting a stick on fire. And yet, for the Jomon, regarded as a Neolithic society of Japan, this couldn't be any further from the truth. First, let's look at their living conditions. It is known that the Jomon lived in open fields, typically near rivers, the ocean, or other bodies of water. In these fields, the Jomon created both small and large pit dwellings, which had a large variety of uses from residential dwellings to those with religious use, and later those with the purpose of burial. The fact that these large sites even exist seems confusing to apply to a hunter-gatherer society, as it would imply that the Jomon would lead lives of sedentism. That's because they were sedentist. Partially. The Jomon are classified as a semi-sedentary society. What this meant was that life for the Jomon was stable enough to live in an area for an extended period of time, but because their agricultural expertise wasn't very developed, it is expected that the Jomon still moved around throughout their lives in order to chase and hunt. Throughout the period of the Jomon, it is seen that their societies became more advanced as well, not only through just their pottery, but also in how they lived. This graph from the World Heritage Prehistoric Sites in Northern Japan demonstrates how the societies advanced throughout the ages. In the earliest eras, the only known settlements were simply just dwellings. A recurring theme about the Jomon and most other prehistoric societies was their separation of graves from other parts, which occurs in the next era, where settlements would consist of a separate living site and a site for the non-living. Settlements would divide up further and feature both storage and dump areas. Until now, religious spaces have not been present in Jomon societies, which would change as the first ritual spaces would now become apparent. The most famous Jomon settlement, Sanai Maruyama, would be made during this time and featured those developments. Jomon society greatly started changing around 2000 BCE, where settlements would remain with residential, dump, and storage areas, but the biggest change would be in how religious and burial areas would be treated. Initial settlements became more dispersed and smaller, while clearly established religious centers with cemeteries had now been started developing during this time period. The last change in Jomon society would separate cemeteries from ritual centers, while still keeping them in close proximity of each other. Now, let's take a closer look at their religion. The religion of the Jomon is known as Ko-Shinto, a predecessor and foundation to the Japanese religion of Shinto. Shintoism can be regarded as a syncretic religion, coexisting with Buddhism and Taoism, as well as being welded by many other different walks of life, such as foreign influence and migrants, just to name a few. In order to understand Ko-Shinto, it will be much easier to first understand Shinto. Shinto and Ko-Shinto are both known to be animist faiths. For those unfamiliar with the term animism, it refers to a style of religion often practiced by more quote-unquote primal societies, wherein it is commonly believed that everything that exists has some sort of god behind it. A good example of this is the Hellenic faith of ancient Greece. While Zeus is the god of thunder and the sky, or Helios is the god of the sun, Shinto equivalents would be Susanoo, the god, or more accurately kami of the storms, and Amaterasu, the kami of the sun. Shintoism believes that everything in the universe that exists, sometimes even purely as concepts, has a kami representing them. Keep in mind that gods in Shinto are not seen as supremely powerful in the same way that Greek gods would be, but rather would have been on the same level as humans, in the sense that they can be killed, but they can also be made, and a bunch of other stuff. Back to Koshinto. How do we know what Koshinto is like? Well, the biggest thing to remember is that Koshinto was pretty much the ancestor of Shinto, and Shinto came about from the syncretism of Buddhism, Taoism, and Koshinto. Therefore, it is assumed that Koshinto is a simpler form of Shinto, excluding elements of Buddhist and Taoist philosophy. It is believed that Koshinto thought there are two worlds, a present world and an eternal world. All people have a soul inside their body, and the soul outside of the body can turn into a kami. Keep in mind that many of these viewpoints are parallel to the ideas of Shinto that still exist today, showing just how intertwined they are. And that's pretty much all we know. Again, not much is known in specifics of how Koshinto would have been practiced because of lack of writing about this subject. Finally, we're done with religion. We now have one final subject, and that is the descendants of the Jomon. If you recall, the last time we talked about how they lived, it seems like their lives started to get much better. Their population was increasing, they were peaceful and formed fairly large communities where they could all depend on each other. So it would only make sense that they were able to prosper for a long time, right? Well, if you know how these questions usually get answered, you can guess that the opposite happened, and if you guessed so, then you'd have guessed correctly. Modern Japanese have only around 20% max Jomon DNA inside of them. Well, where did the other 80% come from? If you recall earlier, I mentioned how around 300 BCE, Sinic migrants came to the Japanese islands. These migrants were known as a Yayoi, and their migrations would constitute the second period of Japanese history, known as a Yayoi period. The Yayoi were able to massively displace the native Jomon because of one simple factor, their knowledge of agriculture. The Yayoi, coming from the now much more developed Chinese and Koreans, knew of all the ins and outs of agriculture, and as a result were able to grow large and numerous rice farms throughout the islands, particularly in the southern regions of Japan. As a result, the Yayoi period marked a significant change in Japanese history, as agriculture was now the dominant source of food as opposed to hunting and gathering. So it seems like the Jomon period is now over. A foreign culture with superior knowledge has now displaced the indigenous people, and any sort of attempt at creating their own region seems totally hopeless. Unfortunately for the Jomon, this was the case. For the main islands of Japan, the Jomon continued to exist on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, which would remain out of Japanese influence for nearly 2,000 years and would develop a rich culture which still exists to this day. Even after the Japanese would enforce their culture on them, they would continue to grow into the group they are now. These people are known as the Ainu. The Ainu, who still live on Hokkaido, continue to practice their traditions which originated from the Jomon, and as such are the only remaining descendants of the Jomon who still live. So we made it to the end! While it did take me a while to make this video, I did greatly enjoy making it and learning more about the Jomon, and I hope that you enjoyed being able to learn more about the Jomon too. If you find this or other parts of Japanese history interesting, here are some resources which you may find interesting that I also recommend.